The next stepping stone in our Vue journey is internationalization. That's a pretty big word. It's also referred to as I-18N because there are 18 letters between the I and the N. I-18N is the process of making your application translation ready. Depending on the needs of your project, you may need to prepare your app for translation. That's what we'll be learning in this section. It's completely optional to make your app translation ready, but there are many obvious benefits to doing so. If you don't plan on ever supporting multiple languages, you can skip this section and move on to the next one. For those of you who are interested, let's get started. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a library called Vue I18N. It's the recommended solution for adding internationalization to your app. We can use it to help us load translations, switch between languages, and translate the strings in our application. Installation and setup are relatively easy. To get started, open the command line in your editor. If the server is running, turn it off. Inside the command line, run the following command: npm install vue i18n at 9. Next, we can start configuring the library. The configuration should be outsourced into a separate file for readability. Inside the source/includes directory, create a file called i18n.js. At the top of the file, import a function called createI18n from the Vue i18n package. The function we've imported will create a plugin for the package. We can use this function to help us configure the settings of the i18n package. From this file, let's export this function from the default namespace. We can pass in an object to begin configuring the package. Inside this object, let's add an option called locale. A locale is a code that represents a language or region. Most locales are 2 or 3 letters long. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a list of language codes. On this page, the second column in the table will contain a complete list of locales. I recommend using the search feature in your browser to help you quickly find your language. You can press Ctrl F or Command F to bring up the search bar. We've been using English as the primary language for this application. The language code is EN. Locales were introduced because different languages will pronounce and spell other languages differently. Rather than decide the proper name, locales were introduced to assign codes to each language. Back in the editor, let's set the locale option to EN. Up next, add an option called fallback locale. If we're going to have multiple languages, it's possible that we're going to miss a few translations. In some cases, the user may switch to a locale that doesn't exist. If that's the case, the Vue i18n plugin will fall back to a different locale. Let's set the fallback option to EN. The last option we'll add is called Messages. The Messages option can contain a list of translations for our app. The value for this option is an object. Inside this object, the property names must be the locale. For example, let's say we wanted to add translations for English. The property name would be called EN. The value is an object of translations. Translations must be provided for all languages, including the default language. Users may want to switch back to the original language. The i18n library will need the original translations if it needs to switch back. In my opinion, I think it would be optimal to outsource the translations into a separate file. It'll be easier to focus on translations as opposed to configuring them from within the file. For this reason, let's create a directory dedicated to translations. Inside the source directory, create a folder called locales. Next, create a file called en.json. Inside this file, let's add an empty object. Lastly, back in the i18n.js file, let's import the English JSON file. Rather than configuring the translations from the file, we can update the messages object to include the English translations. As you can see, this is much cleaner than the previous solution. Our plugin is ready. The final step is to import this file into our main project and register the plugin. Open the main.js file. At the top of the file, import the i18n file. Next, below the list of use functions, add one more use function with the i18n plugin. This should enable internationalization in our app. Let's verify that the app is working by refreshing the page in the browser. Great! Our app is completely functional. In the next set of lectures, we're going to begin exploring the various functions exposed by the Vue i18n package. I'll see you there. In this lecture, we're going to create our first translation. Currently, every component is outputting regular text to the user. It's completely static. The library won't be able to magically replace that text with our translations. We need to write the translations the application will use. After we've written the translations, we need to tell Vue where to load the translations. For this course, we won't be translating every single piece of text because it would be too time-consuming. I'll only be translating bits and pieces to demonstrate how the library works. Let's create our first translation. Open the home component file. In the template, we have a section called Introduction placed at the very top. There's a comment above it that says Introduction heading. For our first translation, we will copy the text in the heading. Next, open the english.json file. Inside the object, the property name must represent the path to the translation. In our app, we can reference a specific translation by its path. Our first translation will have a path of listen. The value for this property can be the translation itself. Let's paste the translation. We've created our first translation. Fantastic! I want to take this a step further. Personally, I prefer to organize my translations by component. This makes it easier to find where a message is used in the application. Vue i18n allows us to organize our translations into nested objects. Let's wrap the listen property with an object called home. I recommend organizing by the component the translation is used in. We're storing the translation in an object called home because the translation will be used in the home component file. Any messages that will be related to the home component will be stored in this object. It's not necessary to organize translations like this. Translations are available to all components. Organizing by object makes it easier to find translations used in specific components. We've created our first translation. The next step is to create another locale file. This way, we can test switching between languages. Feel free to work with any language you'd like. We're going to create a French language file. Inside the source/locales directory, create a file called fr.json. Once again, we're using the locale as the file's name. Next, open the i18n.js file. At the top of the file, import the French JSON file. Add it to the messages object. We can start adding the translations for the French language. There's one thing to keep in mind during this entire process. All language files must have the same paths. For example, in the English file, we have a path called home.listen. Therefore, the French file must have a path called home.listen. During the translation process, the Vue i18n package will search for translations with similar paths. Let's say a component is rendering the text in the home.listen path from the English file. If the user switches to French, it'll search for the same path in the French file. Otherwise, it will be unable to translate the text into the proper language. Let's copy the object from the English file to the French file. We can begin to update the messages to French. It doesn't make much sense if the translations are exactly the same. Using Google Translate, I'm going to translate this into its French counterpart. Before moving on, I want to add a disclaimer. Google Translate comes with an API for translating your content, but it is a paid service. It's a quick and easy way to translate your content, but not completely reliable. I highly recommend hiring a professional translator for translating your application into the desired language. Alright, so we're finished with creating our translations. The introduction heading message is now translated in English and French. The next step is to use the translations in the application. The messages are available to all components because we registered them in the View instance. This registration will take care of injecting the messages into our components. Let's try loading the Listen translation in the Home component. Switch back to the Home component file. Search for the heading tags in the Introduction section. Replace the inner text with an expression that calls the $T function. The $T function is defined by the i18n plugin. It becomes available to our whole application after we've registered the library as a plugin. It has one argument, which is the path to the message. In our case, it would be home.listen. The plugin will be able to resolve this into the proper message. We're done. Let's view the application in the browser. If we did everything right, we would see the message outputted like it was before. But how do we truly know if the message is coming from the locale file? We can go back to the i18n file and change the default locale to French. Update the locale property in the create i18n function to FR. After making those changes, we'll go back to the browser to see what we get. As expected, the French translation will get outputted instead. By changing a single value, we can switch between languages easily. We don't have to worry about creating a solution ourselves because the i18n plugin will handle it for us. That's fantastic. After the initial setup, we can focus solely on translating the strings. There are some scenarios I would like to go over. We'll cover those in the upcoming lectures. We've learned how to translate the app. Overall, it's a simple process. It's a great feature to add unless you plan on serving an audience who speaks one language. Before ending this lecture, I'm going to undo the locale change we made to the i18n.js file. We're going to continue working with English translations. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to make our messages more flexible by using formatting and pluralization. For some translations, simply outputting the message won't be enough. Sometimes we'll want to change the wording in a message based on the values in the database. In other cases, we may want to insert the values into the translation. The i18n library can help us solve these issues. I'm currently viewing a song. We're displaying the number of comments in the header of the comments section. In the heading, we're outputting the word comments. We can translate this word, but what if we have one comment? It wouldn't make sense to use the plural version of the word comment when there's only one comment. A basic conditional statement will work, but we also have to worry about translations as well. The i18n library comes with a simple solution for helping us output the correct translation for words that are either singular or plural. Let's explore how that's done. First, we'll create the translation. Open the English translation file in your editor. We'll add a new path called song.commentCount. Similar to before, we're creating a new object in the translation file called song for messages related to the song component file. The comments message will be stored under this path. The next step is to add the message. View i18n comes with something it calls formatting. Formatting is the process of passing in a value to the message. The value you pass in will appear wherever the translation allows it. It uses interpolation-like expressions. We can insert a placeholder into the message to tell the library where to load the value. Placeholders are created using curly bracket syntax. We'll add the placeholder at the beginning of the message. In between these curly brackets is the name of the placeholder. We're going to call this count. Afterward, we'll add the word comments. The next step is to add this translation to the song component file. Let's open it in our editors. There are 3 sections in this component. The title for the comments can be found in the second section. The text we'll want to translate can be found under the comment that says comment count. Completely replace the inner text with an expression. In the expression, we'll call the $T function. The path to the translation we'll want to output is song.commentCount. The $T function has an optional second parameter. You can pass in an object that will be used to replace the placeholders in the message. The name of the properties in the object must match the names used for the placeholders. We added one placeholder, which was the count placeholder. The value for this will be the number of comments in the song. It's stored in the song.commentCount property. After making those changes, save your files, then view the browser. The message will be outputted along with the number of comments. However, it doesn't change the issue that if there were a single comment, it would output a grammatically incorrect translation. That's the next thing we'll tackle. Vue i18n supports pluralization. It's the process of outputting a translation that can either be singular or plural. We won't have to make any changes to the message to get it working. Switch back to the editor. We'll want to update the message for the comment count path to support pluralization. There are 3 scenarios that we need to account for. The translation for when there are no comments, when there is one comment, and when there is more than one comment. Rather than creating 3 individual translations, we can continue to use a single path by separating the messages with a pipe character. These have to be added in a specific order. Add the following: no comments, pipe, one comment, pipe, count comments. The first message must be for when the number of comments is 0. The second message is for when the number of comments is equal to 1. Lastly, the third message is for when the number of comments is greater than 1. They're separated by pipe characters. Vue i18n is intelligent enough to know which to use. The next step is to update the code in the song component file. Back in the song component file, instead of calling the $T function, replace this with the $TC function. The $T function will not work with plural translations. If we want to support plural translations, we need to use the $TC function. The arguments are slightly different than the $T function. The first argument is the path to the message. We're using the same path. We'll leave the first argument intact. The second argument is a numeric value. This argument will be used to determine which message in the path to use. We'll pass in song.commentCount. The last parameter is the values for the placeholders. We'll use the same object we had before. Placeholders work the same in the $TC function. This is great because we won't have to make further changes. Let's check if pluralization is working in the app. Refresh the page in the browser. Depending on the number of comments, you should see the correct message outputted. By using formatting and pluralization, you can fulfill most of your translation needs. They're very powerful, yet simple to use features for creating translations. You can test pluralization further if you'd like by modifying the comment count property in the document. The correct message will be rendered regardless of the count. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the pluralization documentation page. There's a section that documents how you can take pluralization further by defining a function for languages with more complex rules. I suggest giving it a read in case you need to support languages with such cases. For our app, the solution we're using works fine. In this lecture, we'll learn how to translate numbers in messages. Another part of localization is translating numbers. Mainly, you will want to do that when working with currencies. The I-18N library supports localizing numbers with different currencies. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the number localization documentation page. Feel free to read up on this page after you're finished with this lecture. Here's what we're going to do. Let's say that we want to begin selling music in our app. We'll need to display the price on the page. On top of that, we'll want to display the price in another currency for Japanese buyers. So we'll need to make the price translatable. The process is almost similar to translating any other string. We need to provide translation messages to the I-18N library. After we do that, we can load the translations in the component files. However, there are some discrepancies from regular translations. Firstly, we can't add the translations directly to the locale files. Regular translations and numeric translations must be defined separately. This is because the I-18N instance has a separate option for numeric translations. Open the i18n.js file. Down at the bottom where we export the new instance of the I-18N object, add an option called Number Formats. This option will be an object containing translations for numbers. If you'd like, you can outsource the translations in a separate file. You don't have to add the translations in the file directly. I won't be doing that because the translations won't take up much space in the file. Numeric translations require a different kind of structure than regular translations. This is why we need to separate the translations. In the object, the first layer needs to be the locales we'd like to add translations for. We're going to add two. The first will be English. The second will be Japanese. Its locale is JA. Next, we need to add the name of the translations. We'll be dealing with currencies. It makes sense to call it currency. Here is where things change. Instead of setting the translation to a string, we need to create an object. The object will hold the settings for how the library should translate the string. There are two settings we'll want to set. The first setting is called style. We'll set it to currency. The style property is used to tell I-18N how the numbers will be formatted. Numbers can be formatted in different ways, such as currency, decimals, time, etc. Each of these formats has additional symbols and characters. In our example, we're telling I-18N that the number will be formatted to a currency. If we set the style property to currency, we need to add an additional property called currency. The value for this needs to be a supported currency code. Let's switch to the documentation page for a moment. We'll find a description that tells us the library creates a wrapper around the Internationalization API to translate numbers. If we were to click on the link, we'd be taken to a function called number format. This JavaScript function is capable of translating numbers. The I-18N library takes advantage of this API to translate your numbers. To be a bit more clear about what's going on, the object you passed in for the translations gets passed onto this function. It's called number format. The object is passed in as the second argument for this function. Therefore, you should refer to the documentation when creating settings for numeric translations. Scroll to the constructor section on this page. There's a link to the function that will provide us with more information about the parameters. Click on it. Next, scroll down to the parameters section. Search for the style parameter. This parameter will have more information about the possible values you can pass into this parameter. Since we're setting the style property to currency, let's check out the description for the currency parameter. It'll say the following. The currency to use in currency formatting. Possible values are the ISO 4217 currency codes, such as USD for the US dollar, EUR for the euro, or CNY for the Chinese RMB. There is no default value. If the style is currency, the currency property must be provided. If we were to click on the link in the description, we'd find additional links for the possible codes we can pass in. To save some time, I'll tell you the codes for the currencies we're using. USD for America, JPY for Japan. Let's go back to our editors. In the i18n.js file, set the currency property to USD. Afterward, we're going to make a copy of this and paste it into the Japanese locale. We'll change the currency property to JPY. The translations will now be available in our components. Let's load them in. Open the song component file. Search for the comment that says Song Info. It'll be in the first section where we added the title and artist of the song. We're going to add the price of the song below the genre. Create a pair of div tags with the class SongPrice. Inside the div tags, add an expression that calls the $end function. The $end function will translate numeric values for you. It comes with 3 parameters, but only the first 2 are required. The first is the number. We didn't store the price, but that's perfectly fine. We can hard code the value. Pass in 1. The second parameter is the name of the translation to use. Set this to currency. Before checking if this works, I want to recap what will happen. By calling the $end function, the i18n library will take our numeric value and translate it. It'll use the translations we created in the numbers format option. The first thing it'll do is pick the locale to use. By default, we have it set to English. The value you pass in for the second parameter will tell it which property to use in the locale. It'll run the translation through the currency object's rules because we're setting the second parameter to currency in the $end function. The rules that we're setting will be passed onto the JavaScript number format function along with the number. We're telling JavaScript that the number should be formatted with a currency. In this example, we're using the USD currency. Let's check out the app in the browser. Underneath the genre, we will see the price adequately formatted with the respective symbols. That's great. Let's say we wanted to change the currency to a different one. Normally, we would have to change the locale, but you don't have to in this case. You can change currencies without updating the locale entirely for the app. Back in the song component file, the $n can accept in a third argument. We can pass in the locale we'd like to use. We'll pass in JA for Japanese. Switching back to the browser, the number will be shown in the Japanese currency. One thing I want to point out is that while the i18n library will help you with changing currencies, it won't properly perform a full conversion. $1 and 1 yen don't hold the same value. You can use Google to help you with conversion between currencies. As you can see, about 100 yen is the same as $1. It's important that you account for this as it can lead to confusion and problems down the road. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to add HTML to the translation messages. This process poses a potential risk because you put yourself in a position to be vulnerable to XSS injections. i18n comes with a way to minimize the risk of using HTML in your translations by introducing something called component interpolation. The objective of this lecture is to translate the Terms of Service checkbox on the registration form. It's common practice to create a link to the Terms of Service in the form. We want the checkbox to say, "I accept music's Terms of Service." The phrase Terms of Service will have a link wrapped around it. We want to be able to translate this entire string, including the link. First, let's create the translations. Then we'll work on tying everything together. In your editor, open the English locale file. Inside the locale, we'll create a path called register.accept. We're creating a path for messages related to the register component file. The value for it will be "I accept music's Terms of Service." What we essentially want to do is wrap the phrase Terms of Service with anchor tags. This translation will work, but it's the wrong approach. It opens us up to XSS injections. An XSS injection is when malicious HTML content is inserted into the document. For example, a hacker could replace the link with another link. They could redirect the user to a place where it's not safe. If that's the case, what can we do to prevent this? We can create a placeholder like last time. The placeholder can be replaced with the anchor link along with the translated text. To create a placeholder, first we'll need to separate the translation. We're going to create a new path called register.tos. The value for this will be the phrase terms of service. Splitting your translations like this may not look right, but it is the safer solution for using HTML with your translations. The next step is to add the placeholder. We'll modify the register.accept message by replacing the text terms of service with a placeholder. The placeholder will be called 0. We're not assigning a name as we did before. Despite that, the I18N library will still be able to replace the placeholder. By using numeric values, it'll assume the content you pass along will be used to replace the placeholder. The translations are ready. Let's work on loading it in the component file. Open the register form component file in your editor. In the form element, scroll to the checkbox at the bottom. This element is where we have the checkbox for the terms of service. Below the field component, there's a label element with the content we'll want to translate. We're going to change the label element with a component called I18NT. Previously, we would call the $T function to output translations. However, since we're dealing with HTML, we have the option of using the I18NT component. It does the same thing as the $T function. The difference is that you can load in HTML to replace the placeholder if one is available in the translation. First things first, we need to set the translation to use. We'll add the key path property to the component. We'll set it to register.accept. The key path property is the path to the translation the component should output. It's important that we load in the accept translation because that's where we have the placeholder. Next, we're going to set the tag property to label. The I18NT component can wrap translation with some HTML tags. That's another difference between the library's components and functions. We have the ability to wrap our translation with some HTML by setting the tag property. We're telling the component to add label tags because that's what we previously had for the static message. The very last step is to replace the placeholder in the message. The I18NT component will use the component we pass into the component as the replacement for the placeholder. Any HTML or text we put inside the component will replace the placeholder we had in the register.accept path. We'll create an anchor tag that links to nowhere. Inside of it, call the $T function to load in the register.tos translation. The component will replace the placeholder with the content we passed in. Notice that I'm adding the TOS translation before that's done. This is perfectly allowed and how you would create the second part of the translation. As long as you add a placeholder, the component will be able to make the proper replacement. Let's test things out in the browser. Make sure you're logged out before testing the translation. In the register form, the text has been translated. The link won't work because we didn't point it anywhere. That's fine. It's an example to demonstrate how you would combine HTML and translations with component interpolation. If you want to learn more about component interpolation, then check out the link in the resource section of this lecture. It talks more about how you can use its components to translate messages for more advanced use cases. We've learned a lot about I18N and how to translate our app. Preparing your app for translations is easy, but there's no point in doing so if you can't switch between languages. That's what we'll be learning in this lecture. Every app implements language switching differently. We're going to go for a rather simplistic approach. On the menu, we're going to display the current language. If the user wants to switch languages, we'll let them click on a link that will toggle the language. Switching languages can be risky. I always recommend you add a fallback locale in case the language the user selects doesn't exist for whatever reason. For those of you who are curious, we won't have to worry about an empty page appearing because we have a fallback locale. The plugin configured a fallback for us when we were installing it. If you didn't install View i18n through the plugin, I recommend you add the fallback locale property to the configuration object. It's possible you may decide to remove a language later down the line. A user may visit our app with a language that has been removed. To prevent them from seeing a blank page, we create a fallback language. By setting a fallback, we'll never have to worry about the user seeing a blank page. Let's begin changing languages. Open the header component file in your editor. On the menu, we're going to add a link that will change the language. In our template, search for the primary navigation. We're going to create another unordered list element similar to the first one. We're creating another list because we're going to move the menu item to the right side of the header. It'll stand out if we move it away from the other menu links. We can move the list by applying the ML_Auto class. The ML class will move the list to the right. We want to position the link on the other side of the menu to make it easier to identify. Inside this list, we will add a list element. Inside of it, add an anchor element. Lastly, we'll set the href attribute to a hash. It doesn't matter what the link is. We won't be redirecting the user anywhere. We want to listen for clicks. We'll add the click event listener with the prevent modifier. We're going to change the locale programmatically. That can be done in one line, but I prefer to outsource the code into a separate function. If the link gets clicked, we'll want to call a function called changeLocale. This function doesn't exist. We'll need to create it next. Before proceeding with that, we're going to add an expression inside the link. The expression will be a computed property called currentLocale. We want to be able to output the current language to the user dynamically. Let's define the method and computed property next. First, the method. Down in the script block, add the changeLocale method to the methods object. Every component is injected with an object called $i18n. This object gives you access to the library's functions and properties. It became available to us the moment we registered the plugin. The property we'll want to change is called locale. Set it to the following. This $i18n.locale equals fr en::fr. We're using a ternary operator to make a quick comparison. We're checking if the language is French. If it is, we'll change the value to English. Otherwise, change it to French. We also have Japanese translations, but we'll keep it to English and French to keep things simple. The next step is to create the current locale computed property. Define it inside the computed object of the component. We are creating a computed property because the locale code isn't user-friendly. It would be so much better if we could display the complete language name instead of its code. Inside the function, return the following. This $i18n.locale equals fr French::English. Once again, we're using a ternary operator to check the locale. The full name will be returned based on the locale. We could have performed this code in the template block, but as you can see, the lines can get pretty long. It can make things harder to read. If you're like me, then you may prefer readability over less code. Alright, let's check if everything is working. Switch to your browser. In the menu, we can click on the language to switch languages. By default, the language picker should be English. Clicking on it will change the language to French. Make sure you're on the home page to see the language change. Every time we click, the introduction message on the page changes to the correct language. That's all there is to it. You simply change one property and your entire app will change languages. You can take this a step further by creating a drop-down to toggle between languages. This gives the user a more refined method of switching between languages. The code is all the same. In this lecture, I'm going to encourage you to translate the rest of the app. We've covered everything related to integrating internationalization into an app. We aren't going to translate the rest of the app together because it would be too redundant. So, if you'd like, as an exercise, try translating the app on your own. Let's go over how you would translate the rest of the app. We'll do one translation together. In our project, we have two directories that house our components. Components are responsible for rendering content. Let's open the Manage component file in the Views directory. The first step you would take is looking through the template to find static text. In the component file, we'll find some static text inside the span element with the class card title. The next thing we need to figure out is what kind of translation we'll need to use. Throughout this section, we encountered various ways to translate text. The static text in this element is very plain. I don't think we need to use anything extreme. A basic translation will work. Open the English translation file. In this file, we're going to add a new translation. We'll add a new path called manage.mysongs. The translation will be for the Manage component. We'll nest it inside the Manage object of our translation file. This input will add the translation to our list of translations. We'll modify the translation by adding the phrase My Songs under the Messages column. The next step is to add messages to the other locales. Our app has a locale for the French language. Let's switch over to the French file. In this file, add the manage.mysongs path to the object. We'll quickly grab the translation for this path by translating the phrase My Songs with Google Translate. After grabbing the translation, we'll use this translation for the path. Alright, the last step is to apply the translation to the component. We'll change the static text to an expression. The expression will be the following: $T manage.mysongs. The $T function will take care of translating the text. Let's test the application. Navigate to the Manage page. I'll click on the link for toggling the language. As I do so, the language will toggle without a problem. This is the overall process you'll go through for translating messages. Just repeat these steps and you'll be good to go. I wish you good luck with translating the rest of the application.